This is the latest version of the Abyss Diana headphones, named the MR. I didn't particularly like the second version of the Diana, I really didn't like the third version being the TC, and so I was interested to get my hands on the MR, which is now the fourth version of the Diana, to see if Abyss could get it right on this one. I'd like to start off by saying a huge thanks to Radiance AV, the distributors for Abyss here in Australia now. I want to say a huge thanks to them for sending these out, especially given that I haven't been particularly positive about the Diana range in the past. By way of a quick introduction before we jump into sound quality and then come back around to some of the ergonomics and the design of these, it's worth noting going into this that this is a $3,000 headphone. So it's definitely a flagship level prestige headphone, and the look and the feel of it certainly stacks up, but the big question for me was whether or not the sound would. And the first thing to mention is that when I put these on, I was immediately impressed with the more balanced tuning that they've gone for here compared to the older versions. As I said, I didn't mind the version 2. I thought on the TC they completely missed the mark with the tuning, and now with the MR they've kind of pulled it back a little bit and gone to something a little bit more balanced. Unfortunately though, I would only call it a little bit more balanced, and that's because Abyss seem to really like relying on excess treble in the tuning to make things sound more exciting. And at first listen, they definitely do. But on more extended listening and across a range of different tracks, a range of different genres, I consistently find that treble can become problematic. Now, I should be really clear here, the quality of the treble from these is wonderful. It's smooth, it's never harsh or fatiguing, but there's just too much of it. And what that can do is bring out extra texture and detail in recordings, which, as I said before, can make these sound really exciting at first listen. But what it can also then do is make certain tracks sibilant when they're not meant to be or they're not normally, particularly in vocals, so the actual sibilant sounds like s and t. Those can become quite harsh in recordings when normally they wouldn't be, and at the same time, it just skews the whole frequency response too much in the treble direction, which is a real shame because the bass from these is great. The quality is there, they've got a light touch but it's punchy and really nicely extended. But the problem that I had was that I had to keep turning down the volume because of the treble and therefore couldn't really enjoy the bass. Something else that I found that the treble did was give you a nice sense of imaging focus, but it also makes the soundstage very left-right. These, to me at least, and I can't remember specifically the version 2 and the TC anymore, but these to me seem like the flattest of the lot in terms of soundstage. They've stretched everything left to right, and I find that often happens with treble-emphasised designs. And in fact, the headphone that these most remind me of, and I'm going to upset some people on this one, but these most remind me of sort of a super duper version of the HiFiMan Edition XS, which is to say they've got good linear bass, but too much treble emphasis, and because of that, a very left-right soundstage with almost no depth and layering to it. Now, as I said, technically they're far above the performance of the Edition XS. I'm not saying they're the same, but the overall presentation they result in is very similar. To my ears at least. And so having spent a little bit of time listening to the Diana MRs in isolation, I thought it was now worth putting them up against some competition, and one of the headphones that I reached for a couple of reasons, was the HiFiMan HE1000 SE. Now the reason that I reached for the SE was that it used to be priced about the same as the MR, it's actually now retailing for $2,000, and for my money, it's one of the best flagship type headphones out there at an affordable price. Affordable, relative to other headphones. Another reason that I reached for it though is that for me, the HE1000 SE is borderline on its treble presentation, meaning that at times I do find it just a little bit fatiguing compared to the other headphones I like to use. And so I paired up the HE1000 SE up against the Diana MR to see which I preferred. My testing setup for this was to run my PC with a high quality JCAT USB card. That was feeding through a tubeless USB cable out to the Sengrand DS DAC 1.0. I've got the review for that one coming soon. It's a really interesting DAC. It is also worth noting, it's quite a smooth sounding DAC. It's quite R2R almost in its presentation. And so that was potentially going to give a benefit to these slightly trebly headphones. From the DS DAC 1.0, I was running a set of Curious XLRs, and that was going to the Burson Soloist 3X GT. And as always, I went through a bunch of different tracks and eventually made some notes on Sacred Love by Sting. And as I've already mentioned, the HE1000 SE does produce a bit of extra treble and can get fatiguing. And starting off with the HiFimans, I was finding a little bit of that on this track. They were just a little bit edgy at times and had me reaching for the volume control just to pull it back a bit. On the other hand, they were producing a wonderful sense of space in the mix. and Sting's voice was really nicely separated from the rest of the instruments in the band. The bass had a nice sense of impact without being enhanced in any way, and there was a good sense of layering behind Sting's vocals with the percussion, the horns, etc. There was a good separation and sense of depth in the soundstage. Interestingly, this is a track that I don't listen to a lot, and I noticed that there's some really obvious distortion in the particular version I was listening to, and the HE1000 SE with its slightly enhanced treble really showed me that distortion, for better or worse. But after getting my bearings with the HE1000 SE, it was then over to the Diana MR, and initially the opening percussion in this track sounded wonderful from the MRs. It was going really well. And then there were a couple of cymbal hits and they sounded completely unnatural. Not unnatural in the sense that the tonality was completely off, but because it was way too emphasised. As the track carried on and the vocals came in, the tonality sounded okay. It wasn't way off in things like the vocals and the balance of the vocals. And once again, like the HE1000 SE, there was a bit of fatigue coming from the MRs on this track that was probably just a little tiny bit worse than the HE1000s. That distortion I mentioned before was equally evident from the MRs, so it's just a thing in the track, and both of these being slightly treble emphasised headphones did push that forward. But the key thing for me was the significant reduction in the sense of space in the soundstage. It sounded, listening to the MRs after the HE1000 SE, it sounded like all the musicians or the backing musicians behind Sting took a large step forward. We're not talking a little tiny step, we're talking a significant step forward, and we're right behind Sting. It actually also, interestingly, sounded like Sting took a step forward as well. So everything was closer and everything was flatter in the soundstage, to the point that there's almost no layering and depth to talk of with this particular setup. And I know from a lot of other gear that I listen to that this source chain and this whole setup has plenty of depth to give. And so as I spent more and more time going back and forth with the MR and the HE1000 SE, it became really evident that not only is the spatial presentation better from the HE1000 SE, but the mid-range is better balanced as well. The transition from the bass through the mid-range into the treble, even though there's a treble emphasis in the HE1000 SE, is all better managed. Whereas in the case of the MRs, there's just way too much skew up into that treble. Whilst the Diana MR is probably the best version of the Diana yet, I still don't think it's a great headphone, particularly for $3,000. And the biggest reason for me is not just the tuning, because some people are going to like that tuning. The problem for me is the loss of soundstage quality. Not soundstage quality, that's the wrong term. Soundstage size and layering. The quality's fine, the image placement's good, but it's all too flat. It's not producing the sense of layering, depth and space that a $3,000 headphone should, particularly when I was comparing it against a $2,000 headphone. And that's going to get even worse in just a moment. And so for me, if you were looking at this kind of flagship $3,000 level and you specifically want a detail monster type of headphone, I don't really know why you'd buy these when you could buy yourself an HE1000 SE and EQ a bit of extra treble into it, or just go straight to an HE1000 Stealth. Likewise, and this is where things get a bit worse, I also decided to pick up the Arya Organic and see how that fared against the MR. Now, I didn't put it in my notes because this was an afterthought, but the Arya Organic is way cheaper. The specific price eludes me, but it's way cheaper than the Abyss Diana MR, and the Arya Organic is a better sounding headphone in my opinion. It's got an equal or better sense of articulation in the sound. The comfort from it is better, and yes, we're going to talk about comfort in a moment in the design section of this. It's got a better overall tonal balance, a better mid-range weight, and realistically, there's just nothing about the Arya Organic that to me sounded worse or not as good as the Abyss Diana MR. And so I'm sorry to say that at this point, the Diana MR just isn't stacking up for me. But at the same time, I didn't want to close the door on it just yet, so I did another comparison, partly because I know some of you are going to be hanging for this review, and so this is a bit of a teaser for it. And that's to compare these also to the Meze Empyrean II, which cost exactly the same amount. They're both $3,000 headphones, and I happen to have the Empyrean II here at the same time, so I put them head to head. I was using the same exact source chain as before with the TT2 and the Burst & Soloist 3X GT, etc. And listening to Wait on Love by Travelogue, starting off with the Empyrean IIs. The Empyrean IIs had a wonderful sense of weight and presence, but they were a little bit sibilant in this track at certain moments. However, that was also quite well offset by a good sense of impactful and weighty bass when needed. I think tonally, the mid-range is excellent on the Empyrean IIs from the lower end of the mids all the way up through the main mid-range, and just gets a little bit out of balance for me in the upper mids, as I'll talk about in detail in the full review of the Empyreans. On the other hand, when I went over to the Diana MR, the bass presence and weight just dropped right out of this track. And it was a particular problem because this jazz track uses a double bass. And all of a sudden, listening to the double bass from the Diana MRs, there was no weight, no presence, and no body to what is a large and powerful instrument in terms of its bass presence. The vocals on this one from Coco Rosier are fantastic. They're clear and articulate, but they're also lacking again a little bit of weight and body because she's got quite a big, rich voice. It is worth mentioning that the sibilants were better controlled from the MR than I think they are from the Empyrean II, and so that meant that it was a bit easier to listen to at times, this particular mix on this particular source chain with the MRs. But the naturality was still off because of that skew towards the upper mid-range and most specifically into the treble. Where it became kind of fun was on the saxophone solo. The MR sounded magic because they really focused you in on the saxophone and all of its texture and all of its clarity. But the problem was it was just for that moment of the sax solo, and then once you wanted to hear the rest of the band as the track continued, the double bass was kind of missing in action, the vocals were skewed too much into the texture with not enough weight and body, and things just tonally still sounded off. And so I know a lot of you are going to be upset with me for once again not enjoying an Abyss Diana headphone. I know a lot of you out there love them, but I'm afraid I just don't get it. To me, this is a tonally flawed headphone once again. It's the best of the Diana range, I think. Maybe it and the V2 are interchangeable. The V2 might have done better staging. I don't remember it being as flat as the MR is. But either way, for the price you're paying, I don't think it stacks up. And a part of that is the sound, but another part of that is things like comfort. So let's talk about that now. When I'm looking at a $3,000 headphone, I'm expecting something on the level of the Meze Audios. And I don't mean that everything has to be exactly as good as the Meze Audios. These are an exceptionally comfortable headphone design, whether it's the original Empyreans, the Empyrean IIs, or the Elites. This suspension band design, the beautiful cup shape with the ear pads that are nice and plush, all of this makes for an absolutely astonishingly comfortable headphone. And so this is kind of the benchmark by which I think all other premium headphones should be measured. Not should be necessarily, that's up to you, can be measured or could be measured. And then when we get to the Abyss, they just don't match it. The build quality in terms of the materials, the look, the styling, the ear pads, which are absolutely fantastic, all of that's great. All of that is absolutely brilliant. But the problem for me is that you're getting a headphone here with very little padding, almost no padding. You get in the box some stick-on additional pads, which I still think is a bit of a joke. If you're spending $3,000, why has the padding not been built into the headphone? We're up to the 4th generation now, and it still hasn't changed. That to me is a little bit of a slap in the face if you're spending $3,000. They should be a much more comfortable and overall better ergonomic solution. As I said already, I think the look and styling of them is undeniably very attractive. And I really like this Sapel version with the wood inserts there and the overall colour scheme. You can also get it with 2 different versions of carbon as well. It's a lovely looking headphone without a doubt. Some other things that I do really like is I love the fact they come with a proper hard case now, as you can see here. And so it suddenly makes it a truly more portable headphone rather than the old soft case which could easily get crushed. So I like that. The other thing that I don't particularly like is the cable. And the reason I'm not a fan of the cable is that it splits at the very beginning. And so you've got this cable here that for the entire length of it is 2 separate cables, which means you've got 2 different things to catch on things. It means you've got 2 different things to wrangle when you're trying to coil it up and make it neat and tidy when you're not using it. I just don't understand why they didn't put one more sheath around the whole thing up to a Y-splitter. It would have made it much more ergonomically friendly. It wouldn't have affected the sound quality in any way that I'm aware of. And so I just kind of wonder if Abyss are being quirky and different for the sake of it. I wonder if they just haven't thought stuff through. It makes me question things whenever I look at the Abyss Diana range, not so much the 1266 range, but the Diana range. There just seem to be things about them that don't make a lot of sense. And that all adds up to me to a headphone that I would be uncomfortable recommending to anybody for $3,000. I don't think it's going to be consistently comfortable enough for all people. It's going to be completely comfortable for some people and then not at all for others like me. And in talking to other people that have owned and tried these, it's not just about hair, which I thought it was. I thought maybe because I'm a baldy, that was the problem. But I've spoken to other people with hair who have problems with them and other people without hair who don't have problems with them. So it's just too much of a lucky dip for a $3,000 headphone in my opinion. And then when you throw on top of that the fact that the tonality and the tuning of these is just, for my mind, skewed too much into being exciting and impressive out of the box, but then probably letting most people down from a tonal point of view over the long haul, that to me is where they just don't stack up. And that to me is where I would look at either spending the $3,000 on something like the Empyrean II, or saving some money and buying a HiFiMan HE1000 SE, or even an Arya Organic. And so I'm sorry to say that I'm once again giving a fairly negative review to a pair of Abyss headphones, specifically to the Diana range, which seems to be the problem. The 1266, I totally get why people love those. The Diana range, not so much. Now, of course, if you have them and you love them, I'm not trying to take away from your enjoyment of them. I think it's great that you found a headphone that you enjoy. We're all different. We all hear differently. We've got different hearing characteristics. It's totally fine if you love them. And in fact, I'm glad that you love them. But I won't be recommending to those of you out there that tend to align with my views on headphones and other sound equipment. And so I want to say thanks again to Radiance AV for sending these out. I'm very sorry that I couldn't give them a more positive review. And then for the rest of you, I hope you found this video useful, helpful and informative. Hopefully I've either saved you some money or I've confirmed that these are a good fit for you if you love that detail-oriented treble skewed tuning. As far as that sort of a tuning goes, they're pretty good, so long as you don't want a lot of soundstage depth. And so if you have found this video useful and or enjoyable, then please hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Passion for Sound.